In the criminal underworld of Boston, loyalty was everything until it wasn't. Kevin Weeks learned this lesson the hard way when he discovered that his mentor, the man he'd protected for decades, had been playing everyone for fools. This is what really happened inside the Winter Hill Gang. Told by the one man who saw it all, did it all, and lived to confess. Welcome back to EverKnownOfficial. Don't forget to like the video. The streets of South Boston in the 1970s weren't just streets, they were territories. Invisible lines drawn in blood and enforced with violence. Kevin Weeks was born on March 21, 1956, into this world where being smart was good. But being able to beat someone senseless was real power. Growing up in Southie, as locals called it, meant understanding from an early age that there were rules beyond what the police enforced. Laws written by men who operated in the shadows. Kevin's childhood was a study in contrasts. While his two brothers graduated from Harvard University and sought careers in politics, Kevin took a different path. He graduated from South Boston High School in 1974, ending his formal education. The Weeks family apartment was filled with talk of education, but always with an underlying threat if your grades weren't acceptable. You'd answer to their father. It was a household where achievement was expected, but the methods of enforcement were harsh. The year 1975 marked a turning point in Kevin's life, though he couldn't have known it at the time. He became a bouncer at a popular neighborhood bar called Triple O's Lounge, owned by Kevin O'Neill. Triple O's wasn't just any bar, it was a fortress disguised as a watering hole. A place where legitimate businessmen rubbed shoulders with criminals. Where deals were made over whiskey. And where one wrong word could mean you'd leave in an ambulance or worse. Not leave at all. This was a frequent hangout of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American crime family. And it was here that Weeks first met James "Whitey" Bulger, as well as Bulger's Italian-American partner Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy. That first meeting was unremarkable, just a young bouncer doing his job while the real players conducted their business. But Whitey Bulger had a talent for spotting potential, for seeing in people what they might become rather than what they were. The Winter Hill Gang itself had a bloody history that stretched back decades. The gang was founded in 1961 by James "Buddy" McLean and Howard "Howie" Winter, who were partners in a trucking company. When they became involved in illegal gambling, numbers running, bookmaking and loan sharking in the Winter Hill neighborhood of Somerville, Massachusetts. The organization had survived and thrived through a series of brutal gang wars that had reshaped Boston's criminal landscape. The gang had coexisted in relative peace with the McLaughlin gang from Charlestown until an incident at Salisbury Beach on Labor Day weekend, 1961. When Georgie McLaughlin made an advance on the girlfriend of Winter Hill Gang member Alexander "Bobo" Petricone Jr. and was subsequently beaten unconscious by members of the Winter Hill Gang. That single incident sparked Boston's first Irish gang war, a conflict that would leave dozens dead and establish the Winter Hill Gang as the dominant Irish crime organization in the city. By the time Kevin Weeks was working the door at Triple O's, the Winter Hill Gang had vanquished the McLaughlin Gang of Charlestown, then absorbed the remnants of the Mullen and Killeen gangs of South Boston following a series of Irish gang wars. The gang was at the height of its power, the second most powerful criminal organization in New England, behind only the patriarchal crime family of Providence, Rhode Island. Beginning in 1978, Weeks began working for Bulger part-time as muscle and a personal driver. Impressed by Weeks' knack for making money and genuinely liking him, Bulger decided to bring him in closer than any other associate. It started small, driving Bulger to meetings, standing watch while business was conducted, collecting small debts. But Whitey Bulger didn't do anything without purpose. He was grooming Weeks, testing him, seeing if he had what it took to survive in their world. Meanwhile, Weeks turned to running a loan sharking business on the side. He was learning the trade from the ground up, understanding how fear and money intersected, how to read people. when to push and when to pull back. Every interaction was a lesson, every collection a test of his nerve and judgment. The transformation from bouncer to gangster didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent or ascent, depending on how you looked at it. Each job Weeks did for Bulger brought him deeper into the organization. Each secret shared made him more valuable and more vulnerable. In 1982, 4 years after beginning to work as part of the Winter Hill Gang, Weeks left his legitimate job and became a full-time mobster. The night of May 11, 1982, would cement Kevin Weeks' position in the Winter Hill Gang forever. Bulger was told of the whereabouts of a former associate turned federal informant. Brian Halloran, known on the streets as Balloonhead, owing to the size of his head. Weeks staked out the Pier restaurant, where Halloran and construction worker Michael Donahue were dining together. What happened next would haunt Weeks for the rest of his life. As Donahue and Halloran drove out of the parking lot, Weeks signaled Bulger by stating, "The balloon is in the air," over a handheld radio. Bulger drove up with a masked man armed with a silenced MAC-10. Bulger himself carried a .30 caliber carbine. Bulger and the other shooter opened fire and sprayed Halloran and Donahue's car with lead. Donahue was shot in the head and killed instantly. Weeks would later describe the murders of Halloran and Donahue as the event which cemented his association with Bulger, saying, "I was involved in a double homicide, so I knew there was no getting out." That night he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He was no longer just muscle or a driver, he was an accomplice to murder. Weeks became a protege to Bulger, who groomed him as his successor and treated him like a son. In the criminal hierarchy of South Boston, this was everything. To be chosen by Whitey Bulger meant protection, money, and respect. It also meant living with the constant knowledge that the man who treated you like family would kill you without hesitation if you crossed him. During the 1980s, Weeks operated several convenience stores and liquor marts in South Boston that served as fronts for the Winter Hill Gang. He collected payments from loan sharks and bookmakers, insulating Bulger from the transactions, and also helped extort local criminals and businessmen who were behind on their debts to the gang. The business model was brutally simple. In 1982, Weeks went with Bulger full-time. They became partners, running legitimate businesses and some not-so-legitimate businesses. Basically, they were gangsters. They took what they wanted. They shook down drug dealers, bookmakers. The legitimate businesses provided cover for the real moneymakers' extortion, loan sharking, and drug dealing. Weeks said, "Everything I did, every business I had, Jim Bulger and Steve Flemmi were my partners always." This partnership meant that Weeks was never truly independent. Every dollar he earned, every move he made, was tied to Bulger and Flemmi. It was a golden cage, profitable but inescapable. One of the most notorious examples of their methods came in 1983. Weeks and O'Neill acquired Stippo's Liquor Mart in South Boston from owners Stephen and Julie Rakes by using threats of violence. The acquisition of the liquor store showed how the gang operated. They didn't always need to use violence. The threat of it was often enough. Rakes had come to them asking for help in finding the person who was calling in bomb threats. Rakes settled on $100,000 to sell the store, but then tried to back out of the sale. They were sitting in Rakes' kitchen at his house on 4th Street, while Bulger allegedly played with Rakes' 2-year-old daughter at his home. When Flemmi reportedly put a gun on the table to show that they meant business. The message was clear: sell or suffer the consequences. The store was renamed South Boston Liquor Mart and became a frequent hangout of Bulger and Flemmi. It was another piece of their empire, another legitimate front for illegitimate activities. Every business they touched became part of the web, another node in their network of crime and corruption. The drug business marked a new chapter in the Winter Hill Gang's operations. While Bulger and Flemmi had traditionally focused on gambling and loan sharking, the 1980s brought new opportunities and new dangers. The money in drugs was astronomical compared to their traditional rackets. But it also brought increased law enforcement attention and violence from competing dealers. According to Weeks's memoir, Bulger began calling drug dealers from throughout the Boston area for meetings, at which he would tell them that he had been offered a contract on their life. He would then demand a large payoff not to kill them. It was extortion dressed up as protection, and it worked brilliantly. The drug dealers already operating outside the law had nowhere to turn. They could pay Bulger or die. The violence that underpinned their operations was never far from the surface. What were the dealers gonna do? Go to the police? They beat people up, shot and stabbed them, and they made people disappear permanently. This was the reality of life in the Winter Hill Gang. Violence wasn't just a tool. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. But there was something else going on beneath the surface, something that would only come to light years later. The Winter Hill Gang's success wasn't just due to violence and intimidation. They had help from an unexpected source, the FBI itself. Flemmi and Bulger relayed information on fellow members of the Winter Hill Gang to the FBI. When they had nothing to report, they would make up information to ensure that they were seen to be of high value to the agency. This relationship with the FBI was the gang's biggest secret and its greatest asset. While other criminal organizations were being dismantled by federal investigators, the Winter Hill Gang operated with near impunity. They knew when raids were coming, when informants were talking, and when to lay low. It was a corruption that went to the heart of law enforcement in Boston. The arrangement was simple but devastating in its implications. Bulger and Flemmi would provide information about their rivals and even their own associates to the FBI. In return, they received protection from prosecution and intelligence about law enforcement activities. Bulger was never an informant for the FBI. The FBI were informants for Bulger. They considered Connolly a criminal too. He was their informant. Special Agent John Connolly was at the center of this corrupt relationship. He had grown up in the same South Boston housing project as Bulger and had maintained that connection throughout his FBI career. What started as a legitimate attempt to cultivate informants had evolved into something far more sinister. Connolly wasn't running Bulger, Bulger was running him. In 1990, she and his associates were arrested as part of a joint investigation involving the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Boston Police Department, and the Massachusetts State Police. All refused to testify against Bulger, Flemmi, and Weeks. Of course, Bulger lost money once the drug dealers were removed from the streets in the summer raid. But he always had other business going on. Knowing he had to build something on the side, Weeks had concentrated on his shylocking and gambling businesses. The drug business had been good while it lasted, but their major involvement in it was over. The arrests of their drug-dealing associates in 1990 marked a turning point. The heat was increasing, and even the FBI's protection had limits. But Bulger adapted, as he always did. He shifted focus back to traditional rackets while maintaining his grip on power through fear and violence. Weeks confessed to being an accessory to 5 murders. In 2000, he led authorities to 6 different bodies buried by the Winter Hill Gang, including the triple grave of Hussey, McIntyre, and Barrett. Each of these murders had a story, a reason in the twisted logic of organized crime. Deborah Hussey was Flemmi's stepdaughter, killed because she knew too much and had become unstable. John McIntyre was an informant who had tried to cooperate with authorities about the gang's gun-running operations. Arthur "Bucky" Barrett was involved in a bank robbery and was killed for his share of the take. The murder of Deborah Davis in 1981 was particularly brutal. According to Weeks' testimony, Flemmi, who had dated Davis since she was a teenager, wrapped duct tape around her mouth, kissed her on the forehead, and whispered, "You are going to a better place." Davis was then strangled and her teeth and hands were removed. The removal of teeth and hands was standard practice. It made identification of bodies difficult in an era before DNA testing was common. These weren't just murders, they were disappearances. People would vanish from South Boston, and everyone would know what had happened, but no one would talk. The bodies would be buried in basements or dumped in secret locations, and life would go on. The message was clear to everyone in the neighborhood. Cross the Winter Hill Gang and you wouldn't just die, you'd disappear entirely. Bulger became a fugitive after he was indicted on racketeering charges in January 1995. And Weeks subsequently acted as operational chief of the Winter Hill Gang, taking orders from Bulger via frequent telephone calls. Weeks funded Bulger by funneling thousands of dollars into his bank account. Even in exile, Bulger maintained control of his organization through Weeks, who had become his most trusted lieutenant. But the walls were closing in. The FBI's protection of Bulger had become a scandal, and new agents and prosecutors were determined to bring down the Winter Hill Gang. The code of silence that had protected the organization for decades was beginning to crack. Associates were being arrested, and the threat of life sentences was making even hardened criminals reconsider their loyalty. On November 17, 1999, Weeks O'Neill and other Winter Hill associates were arrested in South Boston by agents of the DEA, the Massachusetts State Police, and the Internal Revenue Service. The next afternoon, he was presented with a 29-count indictment under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which alleged extortion, money laundering, and drug trafficking. A 79-page affidavit by State Police Lieutenant Thomas Duffy provided a broad outline of the activities of the Winter Hill Gang and listed various criminal acts committed by Weeks. The charges carried a potential sentence of life imprisonment. The arrest was the culmination of years of investigation by law enforcement agencies that had finally broken through the wall of corruption that had protected the Winter Hill Gang. For Weeks sitting in that federal detention center, the reality of his situation was stark. He was facing the rest of his life in prison, and the man he had protected for decades was nowhere to be found. Bulger was on the run, living under assumed names, while Weeks sat in a cell contemplating his future. At first refusing to cooperate, Weeks was transferred to a federal penitentiary in Rhode Island. Imprisoned in Rhode Island. It took about 2 weeks for Weeks to decide to cooperate with authorities, leading some in South Boston to dub him Kevin Squeaks or 2 Weeks. The decision to cooperate wasn't made lightly. In the world Weeks came from, there was no greater sin than being a rat. It meant not just shame but death if the wrong people got their hands on you. But sitting in that Rhode Island prison, Weeks had a revelation that would change everything. He was approached by one of his fellow prisoners, a member of the Patriarcha crime family, who asked him, "Kid, what are you doing? Are you going to take it up the ass for these guys? Remember, you can't rat on a rat. Those guys have been giving up everyone for 30 years. The truth hit Weeks like a sledgehammer. Shortly before his own arrest in 1999, he found out that Bulger had been an FBI informant even before Weeks entered the scene. Everything he thought he knew about loyalty and honor in their world was a lie. Bulger, the man who had preached about the code of silence, who had killed people for being informants, had been the biggest informant of them all. In addition, Weeks was also deeply affected by the cooperation of John Martorano, a legendary hitman for the Winter Hill Gang. If Martorano, who had killed 20 people for the organization, could cooperate, then what was Weeks holding out for? The code of silence had already been broken by the very people who had enforced it most brutally. The psychological impact of discovering Bulger's betrayal cannot be overstated. Weeks had built his entire adult life around loyalty to a man who had been betraying everyone around him for decades. Every murder committed to protect the organization's secrets, every person killed for being a suspected informant, had been based on a lie. Bulger had been feeding information to the FBI while ordering the deaths of others for doing the same thing. When asked if he had any remorse about the people he confessed to killing, Weeks, who Bulger had once described as a surrogate son, answered that he did feel bad. "Because we killed people that were rats and I had the biggest rats right next to me," Weeks testified. The irony was bitter. They had killed people for being informants while working for the biggest informant of them all. The information Weeks provided to authorities was devastating to what remained of the Winter Hill Gang. He led authorities to 6 different bodies buried by the Winter Hill Gang, including the triple grave of Hussey, McIntyre, and Barrett. Each body recovered was evidence of murder, each grave a testament to the gang's brutality. But Weeks didn't just provide information about murders. He revealed the entire structure of the Winter Hill Gang's operations, the extortion rackets, the drug dealing, the corruption of law enforcement officials. He explained how they had operated with impunity for so long, protected by the very people who were supposed to be investigating them. His testimony is viewed as responsible for the convictions of FBI agent John Connolly, as well as forcing Bulger's right-hand man, Stephen Flemmi, to plead guilty as well. Connolly's conviction was particularly significant. It exposed the depth of corruption within the FBI's Boston office and led to a complete overhaul of how the Bureau handled informants. The picture that emerged from Weeks' cooperation was of an organization that had corrupted everything it touched. Legitimate businesses had been turned into fronts for criminal activity. Law enforcement had been compromised at the highest levels. Politicians had been bought or intimidated into silence. The Winter Hill Gang hadn't just been a criminal organization. It had been a cancer eating away at the fabric of Boston society. The courtroom erupted in chaos. The F word was the expletive of choice in the fiery exchange between Bulger and Weeks in the courtroom. Years of pent-up rage and betrayal exploded in that moment. 2 men who had once been like father and son, now separated by bulletproof glass and the weight of their crimes. The exchange would become one of the most memorable moments of the 2013 trial. But it was just one scene in a drama that had been building for decades. To understand the full impact of Kevin Weeks' testimony, you have to understand what it meant in the context of Boston's criminal underworld. This wasn't just about putting one man in prison. This was about dismantling a mythology that had protected organized crime in Boston for generations. The Code of Silence, Omerta. The sacred oath never to cooperate with law enforcement. These weren't just words. They were the foundation upon which entire criminal empires were built. Weeks shouted from the witness stand. 5 people are dead. It bothers me because we killed people who are rats. And I had the 2 biggest rats right next to me. In reference to Bulger and Steve, the rifleman, Flemmi's cooperation with the FBI. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. They had murdered people for being informants, while the biggest informants of all were running the organization. When asked about lying, Weeks answered, "I've been lying my whole life." I'm a criminal, but there was a distinction in his mind between the lies he had told as a criminal and the truth he was now telling on the witness stand. He had testified in nearly 5 trials by this point, each time providing crucial evidence that helped convict corrupt law enforcement officials and fellow gangsters. The prosecution's case against Bulger relied heavily on Weeks' testimony. Weeks was critical to the prosecution's case against Bulger. He's the guy that led police to the graves of several victims. In his first day of testimony, he made a direct connection between Bulger and 2 murders. Without Weeks, many of the bodies might never have been found, and the families of the victims would never have had closure. On the witness stand, Weeks said that Bulger, in May 1982, disguised himself with a fake mustache to look like another well-known South Boston gangster, and then shot up a car in which Brian Balloonhead Halloran had hitched a ride. The driver of the blue Datsun was Michael Donahue, an innocent man who had stopped by a South Boston watering hole for a drink when Halloran asked him for a ride home. The Donahue family's pain was palpable in the courtroom. Tommy Donahue commented on Weeks' testimony, "Tears you apart, hearing the horrific story. It's horrible listening to that, it shakes my whole entire family. They just murdered 2 people like it was nothing, for the families of the victims." Weeks' testimony was both a blessing and a curse. It provided answers. But those answers came with graphic details of how their loved ones had died. According to Weeks's testimony, Bulger attempted to strangle McIntyre. But the rope he used was too thick. "You want one in the back of the head?" Bulger asked. Bulger shot him in the head, Weeks said. Flemmy thought he was still alive, so Bulger fired several more shots. These weren't just statistics or names on a list. These were human beings who had been murdered in the most brutal ways imaginable. Weeks also described the killing of Deborah Hussey, the daughter of Flemmy's longtime girlfriend, Marion Hussey, in January 1985. According to Weeks, Flemmy brought Hussey to the East 3rd Street house, and Weeks didn't think anything of it at the time. "She wasn't a criminal, she wasn't involved with us. I didn't think anything was going to happen to her," Weeks said. But when he went upstairs, he heard a thud, he said. And when he came downstairs, he said, he saw Bulger on the floor choking Hussey. His legs wrapped around her for several minutes. She was brought to the basement, but Flemmy thought she was still alive, so he strangled her again, according to Weeks. The bodies had to be moved when the house was being sold. Weeks testified that on Halloween in 1985, Bulger, Weeks, and Flemmy exhumed the bodies to begin the process of burying them across from Florian Hall in Dorchester. Imagine the grotesque nature of this task, digging up decomposing bodies on Halloween night, the holiday when children dress as monsters, while real monsters moved corpses through the streets of Boston. Weeks led investigators to the burial site in January 2000, after he began cooperating with authorities after he was indicted. The discovery of these bodies was a watershed moment in the investigation. For years, families had wondered what had happened to their loved ones. Now they knew, and the knowledge was devastating. Meanwhile, as Weeks was providing this testimony, Whitey Bulger had been living a completely different life. After 16 years at large and 12 years on the FBI 10 most wanted fugitives list, Bulger was arrested in Santa Monica, California, on June 22, 2011. He was 81 years old at the time of the arrest. For 16 years, while the families of his victims grieved and law enforcement agencies spent millions trying to find him, Bulger had been hiding in plain sight in a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica. Bulger and Greg drove across the country, stopping numerous times before settling in Santa Monica, California. Money wasn't scarce. Bulger's net worth was estimated at around $50 million before he fled. And at the time of his arrest in 2011, investigators found $822,000 in cash in the walls of his Santa Monica apartment. The method of his capture was almost anticlimactic after such a long manhunt. Eventually, Bulger's luck ran out, but only after the FBI turned its attention to Bulger's accomplice, Greg. The Bureau contacted and took out advertisements with plastic surgery and dental trade magazines asking for tips to find her. They then aired those photographs on TV ads across the country, loudly advertising the $2 million reward. Within a day of those ads running, a former neighbor called to report the fugitive couple's Santa Monica address. The next morning, on June 22, 2011, Bulger was arrested in the building's parking garage, after being lured out under false pretenses by the building manager. After 16 years of freedom, it took less than 48 hours from the launch of the new campaign targeting Greg to capture one of America's most wanted fugitives. Bulger would probably still be living this unassuming lifestyle if it weren't for his girlfriend's love of cats. An Icelandic neighbor who was an actress and yoga teacher had seen an FBI video about Bulger. She recognized Greg as someone with whom she shared an interest in caring for stray cats. Within 24 hours of her contacting the FBI, Bulger and Greg were under arrest. The irony of Bulger's capture, brought down by his girlfriend's kindness to stray cats, would have been laughable if not for the trail of bodies he had left behind. The apartment's managers said the couple, who went by the names Charles and Carol Gasco, had lived there 15 years and were ideal tenants who always paid their rent on time and in cash. After the arrests, Bulger consented to a search of the residence. The FBI's evidence response team found in excess of $800,000 in cash, more than 30 firearms, and false identification. He had been prepared to run again at a moment's notice, but the moment never came. Back in Boston, the news of Bulger's capture sent shockwaves through the community. For some, it was a moment of triumph, justice, finally catching up with a man who had evaded it for so long. For others, particularly the families of his victims, it was the beginning of a new chapter of pain, as they would have to relive their losses through the trial process. On June 12, 2013, Bulger went on trial in South Boston's John Joseph, Moakley United States Courthouse before Judge Denise J. Casper on 32 counts of racketeering and firearms possession. The racketeering counts included allegations that Bulger was complicit in 19 murders. The trial lasted 2 months and included the testimony of 72 witnesses. The trial was a media circus. Every day, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, some to support Bulger, believing in the Robin Hood myth that had been carefully cultivated over the years. Others to see justice finally done. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. From the time he graduated from high school back in 1974, Kevin Weeks became the chief enforcer for Whitey Bulger. He became his right-hand man. He was with him so much that he really became known as Bulger's surrogate son. The operation worked by fear, and terror. Weeks described how Bulger would summon people to the 3rd floor of Triple O's, in a dark office in which he thrust a machine gun in somebody's chest and said, "You're either going to pay up or you're going to die." The testimony painted a picture of an organization that had corrupted everything it touched. Law enforcement, politicians, legitimate businesses, all had been tainted by their association with the Winter Hill Gang. The FBI's reputation in Boston was in tatters, with the revelation that agents had been on Bulger's payroll for years. On August 12, the jury convicted Bulger of 31 out of 32 counts in the indictment. As part of the racketeering charges, the jury convicted Bulger of the murders of 11 victims. The verdict was a victory for prosecutors, but for the families of the victims, it was bittersweet. No verdict could bring back their loved ones. On November 14, 2013, Bulger was given 2 life sentences plus 5 years. At 84 years old, Bulger would die in prison. There would be no more escapes, no more life on the run. The man who had terrorized Boston for decades would spend his final years in a cage. But the story didn't end with Bulger's conviction. On October 30, 2018, Whitey Bulger was found dead in his cell at USB Hazleton, a federal prison in West Virginia. His eyes had nearly been gouged out and his tongue almost cut off. A law enforcement official described Bulger as unrecognizable. This was the 3rd homicide at the prison in a 40-day span. The brutal manner of Bulger's death seemed like a final act of street justice. He had been transferred to Hazleton just the day before, and within hours of his arrival, he was dead. The man who had killed so many, who had corrupted law enforcement and destroyed families, met his end in the same violent manner he had dispensed to others. Fodio's Freddie Gesh, a Western Massachusetts-based hitman for the Genovese crime family, was the primary suspect in orchestrating the killing of Bulger. For Kevin Weeks, life after prison has been a journey of reinvention. Weeks was released from federal prison in early 2005. He collaborated with journalist Phyllis Carras to write Brutal, the untold story of my life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish mob. The profits from the book were partially used to compensate victims as part of a civil suit against Weeks. At a book signing in April 2006, Kevin Weeks told the crowd at a Boston Barnes and Noble that he once intended to return to being a gangster once he was released from prison. "Now I can't," he quipped. "Everybody knows my face." The notoriety that came with his cooperation had effectively ended any possibility of returning to his old life. Kevin Weeks is out of prison and living a clean life in Massachusetts. But living a clean life doesn't mean escaping the past. After serving time in prison, Kevin Weeks has since been released and has maintained a relatively low profile. He has made occasional media appearances and continues to be associated with his past as a former member of the Winter Hill Gang. The story of Kevin Weeks is ultimately a story about the corrosive nature of violence and the price of loyalty misplaced. He gave the best years of his life to a man who was betraying everyone around him. He participated in murders to protect secrets that weren't worth protecting. He enforced a code that his boss was violating every single day. But it's also a story about the possibility of redemption, however limited. Weeks could have maintained his silence, could have taken a life sentence rather than cooperate. Many in his position have done exactly that. Instead, he chose to tell the truth, to lead investigators to bodies, to help families find closure. It doesn't erase what he did, but it represents a choice to stop the cycle of violence and lies. The victims' families have mixed feelings about Weeks. Some see him as just another criminal trying to save his own skin. Others acknowledge that without his cooperation, they might never have known what happened to their loved ones. "I think Weeks is a fat liar if you ask me," said Tommy Donahue. The pain in his voice was understandable. Weeks had been there when his father was murdered, had helped dispose of the weapons, had kept the secret for years. The corruption that allowed the Winter Hill Gang to operate with impunity for so long has left lasting scars on Boston. The FBI's Boston office underwent massive reforms. New procedures were put in place for handling informants. The cozy relationship between law enforcement and organized crime that had characterized Boston for decades was finally exposed and dismantled. John Connolly, the FBI agent at the center of the corruption, was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Weeks's testimony is viewed as responsible for the convictions of FBI agent John Connolly, as well as forcing Bulger's right-hand man, Stephen Flemmi, to plead guilty as well. The man who had been tasked with fighting organized crime had become part of it, and his downfall represented a moment of reckoning for law enforcement. Stephen Flemmi, Bulger's partner, also cooperated with authorities and is serving a life sentence. The Winter Hill Gang, once the most powerful Irish crime organization in America, effectively ceased to exist. Its members were either dead, in prison, or in witness protection. The empire that Bulger and Flemmi had built over decades crumbled in a matter of years once the truth started coming out. Today, Kevin Weeks is a law-abiding citizen, making an honest living in construction. Living a quiet, simple life. Close to his 2 sons and his beautiful, pregnant new wife, Anna, whom he loves dearly. It's a far cry from the days of driving Whitey Bulger around South Boston, collecting debts and burying bodies. But the ghosts of the past don't disappear easily. Every time Weeks walks through South Boston, he passes places where crimes were committed, where bodies were buried, where lives were destroyed. The neighborhood has changed, gentrification has transformed much of Southie, but the memories remain. The families of the victims continue to struggle with their losses. No amount of testimony, no conviction, no book deal can bring back Michael Donahue, Deborah Hussey, John McIntyre, or any of the other victims. Their families live with the knowledge that their loved ones died brutal deaths, that their bodies were hidden for years, that the people responsible were protected by the very institutions meant to pursue justice. The story of the Winter Hill Gang is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of the informant system. When law enforcement becomes too close to criminals, when the lines between good guys and bad guys blur, the results can be catastrophic. The FBI's use of Bulger and Flemmi as informants didn't reduce crime in Boston, it enabled it. It didn't bring down the Mafia, it empowered their rivals. Before we continue, a quick clarification. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. This content does not promote, glorify, justify, or encourage violence, criminal behavior, gangs, or illegal activity of any kind. The intent is to educate viewers about real-world crimes, their consequences, and the social and psychological factors behind them. All events discussed are based on publicly available information and are presented to highlight their consequences. Viewer discretion is advised. Weeks had said to a reporter, in fact, the last line of his book he wrote, I hope they never find him. He said everything I was my whole life was Bulger. This confession reveals the deep psychological bonds that held the Winter Hill Gang together. For weeks, Bulger wasn't just a boss, he was a father figure, a mentor, the center of his universe. The betrayal Weeks felt upon learning that Bulger had been an informant cannot be overstated. Everything he had believed in, every principle he had lived by, every crime he had committed in the name of loyalty, all of it had been based on a lie. The man who had preached about honor among thieves had no honor at all. At a book signing, Kevin Weeks told the crowd that he once intended to return to being a gangster once he was released from prison. Now I can't, he quipped, everybody knows my face, but perhaps that recognition, that inability to return to the shadows, is its own form of justice. Weeks must live with what he's done, must face the families of victims, must carry the weight of his crimes for the rest of his life. The younger generation in South Boston has grown up with the Whitey Bulger story as history rather than current events. To them, the Winter Hill Gang is something their parents talk about, stories from a different era. The South Boston of today, with its expensive condos and trendy restaurants, bears little resemblance to the working-class neighborhood where Bulger built his empire. But the lessons of the Winter Hill Gang remain relevant. The corruption that allowed them to thrive, the culture of silence that protected them, the violence they used to maintain power, these are not unique to Boston or to the Irish mob. They're patterns that repeat themselves wherever organized crime takes root, wherever corruption infiltrates law enforcement, wherever loyalty is valued above truth. Kevin Weeks' confession, his decision to cooperate, represents a crack in that wall of silence. It wasn't a heroic act, he did it to save himself from a life sentence. But in telling the truth about what really happened inside the Winter Hill Gang, he helped expose a system of corruption that had poisoned Boston for decades. The emotional toll of this story extends far beyond the immediate victims. There are the children who grew up without fathers, the parents who buried their children, the siblings who lost brothers and sisters. There are the honest cops who were undermined by their corrupt colleagues, the prosecutors who saw cases fall apart because of leaked information, the witnesses who were too terrified to come forward. "What did I win?" shouted Weeks from the witness stand. "5 people are dead. It bothers me because we killed people who are rats. And I had the 2 biggest rats right next to me." This moment in the courtroom, this explosion of emotion, captured the fundamental tragedy of the Winter Hill Gang. They had built their entire world on a foundation of lies, had killed to protect secrets that weren't even secrets, had destroyed lives in service of men who were betraying them daily. The fact that Bulger was living comfortably in Santa Monica while the families of his victims struggled with their grief adds another layer of injustice to the story. Bulger was cautious with how he spent his money, out of fear that the cash could be traced. The mobster confided that he was worried his outdated large bills might draw suspicion, so he'd regularly take loads of cash to Las Vegas. He was living a careful but comfortable retirement while his victims lay in unmarked graves. Today, the legacy of the Winter Hill Gang serves as a reminder of what happens when crime and law enforcement become intertwined. The damage done to Boston's institutions, to public trust in law enforcement, to the families torn apart by violence, all of it stems from the decision to use criminals as informants without proper oversight or accountability. Kevin Weeks' story doesn't have a neat ending. There's no moment of redemption that erases the past, no gesture that can undo the damage done. Weeks was released from federal prison in early 2005. He collaborated with journalist Phyllis Caras to write Brutal, the untold story of my life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish mob. Weeks's account of his life with Bulger and Flemmi, which was published in March 2006. The title of his book, Brutal, is appropriate. There's nothing romanticized about his account of life in the Winter Hill Gang. It's a brutal story told with brutal honesty about brutal men who did brutal things. The book serves as both a confession and a warning. This is what organized crime really looks like, stripped of the Hollywood glamour and mythology. As we reflect on what really happened inside the Winter Hill Gang, we're left with difficult questions. How do we balance the need for information in criminal investigations with the danger of becoming too close to criminals? How do we ensure that law enforcement maintains its integrity while operating in the shadows of the underworld? How do we prevent another Winter Hill Gang from rising? The answers aren't simple. The informant system, despite its flaws, has helped solve countless crimes and save lives. But the Winter Hill Gang case shows what happens when that system operates without proper oversight. When personal relationships override professional responsibilities. When the pursuit of bigger fish justifies protecting smaller predators who turn out to be sharks themselves. For Kevin Weeks, the journey from mob enforcer to government witness to published author and public speaker represents one of the strangest character arcs in American crime history. He went from being invisible, operating in the shadows, to being one of the most recognized faces from Boston's criminal past. Every appearance, every interview, every signing of his book is a reminder of what he was and what he did. The emotional twist in this story isn't just about betrayal or corruption or violence. It's about the complete waste of human potential. Kevin Weeks was intelligent, capable, loyal qualities that could have served him well in legitimate pursuits. Instead, he spent decades as a criminal, destroying lives including his own. Whitey Bulger was reportedly brilliant, with an IQ that could have taken him anywhere. Instead, he chose to become a monster. The victims of the Winter Hill Gang were sons and daughters, fathers and mothers. People with dreams and hopes and families who loved them. Their lives were cut short for the pettiest of reasons. They knew too much. They owed money, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each murder created ripples of pain that continue to this day, grief that will never fully heal. And what about South Boston itself? The neighborhood that nurtured and protected the Winter Hill Gang has had to reckon with its own complicity. The code of silence that kept Bulger in power wasn't just about fear. It was about a culture that valued loyalty to the neighborhood above cooperation with outsiders. Even when those outsiders were trying to solve murders. The transformation of South Boston from a working-class Irish enclave to a gentrified extension of downtown Boston represents its own kind of death. The community that created Whitey Bulger and Kevin Weeks no longer exists in the same form. The tribal loyalties, the us versus them mentality, the acceptance of violence as a way of settling disputes, all of this has been diluted by demographic change and economic transformation. But perhaps that transformation is necessary. Perhaps the old South Boston, for all its strong sense of community and identity, was too tolerant of men like Bulger, too willing to look the other way, too invested in myths of loyalty and honor that masked brutal criminality. As Kevin Weeks lives out his days as a free man, he carries with him the weight of his choices. Every morning he wakes up knowing what he's done, knowing that he can never fully atone for his crimes. The families of his victims wake up every morning with their own burden, the absence of loved ones who should still be alive. The story of what really happened inside the Winter Hill Gang is ultimately a tragedy without heroes. There are only villains and victims, corrupt cops and honest ones undermined by corruption, killers and the killed. It's a story about how power corrupts, how loyalty can be perverted, how institutions meant to protect can become instruments of oppression. Kevin Weeks' confession pulls back the curtain on this world, revealing it in all its ugliness. There's no glory in what the Winter Hill Gang did, no honor among these thieves, no code worth following. There's only violence and greed and betrayal, dressed up in myths of brotherhood and loyalty. The most powerful emotional truth of this story is this: evil is banal. The Winter Hill Gang weren't criminal masterminds playing three-dimensional chess. They were thugs who killed people, corrupt cops who sold their badges, men who chose easy money over honest work. They destroyed lives not for some grand purpose but for money and power and the petty satisfaction of being feared. And in the end, they destroyed themselves. Whitey Bulger died brutally in prison. Stephen Fleming will die behind bars. John Connolly lost everything, his reputation, his freedom, his legacy. And Kevin Weeks, though free, remains imprisoned by his past, unable to escape the shadow of what he's done. This is what really happened inside the Winter Hill Gang, not a glamorous crime story, but a sordid tale of waste and destruction, of lives thrown away for nothing, of a community corrupted and families destroyed. It's a cautionary tale about the true cost of crime, measured not in prison sentences or money, but in human suffering that echoes through generations. The confession of Kevin Weeks forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about crime, punishment, and justice. He served only 5 years for his involvement in 5 murders. Was that justice? He helped solve crimes that might never have been solved otherwise. Does that matter to the families of the victims? He told the truth when he could have remained silent. Should that count for something? There are no easy answers. Justice in the end is imperfect. No punishment can bring back the dead. No confession can undo the damage done. All we can do is learn from these tragedies, work to prevent them from happening again, and remember the victims who paid the ultimate price for the crimes of the Winter Hill Gang. As this documentary comes to a close, we're left not with resolution but with reflection. The story of Kevin Weeks and the Winter Hill Gang is a mirror held up to society, showing us what happens when institutions fail, when communities choose silence over justice, when loyalty becomes a weapon rather than a virtue. The real tragedy isn't just what happened inside the Winter Hill Gang, it's that it was allowed to happen for so long, that so many people knew and said nothing, that it took decades for the truth to finally come to light. The blood on Kevin Weeks' hands is also on the hands of everyone who enabled, protected, and turned a blind eye to the Winter Hill Gang's reign of terror. In the end, Kevin Weeks' confession is both an ending and a beginning, the end of the Winter Hill Gang's secrets, and the beginning of a reckoning with the damage they caused. It's a story without heroes, but perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. In the real world of organized crime, there are no heroes, only different degrees of villainy and victimhood. The streets of South Boston are quiet now, gentrified and peaceful. But beneath the surface, in the memories of those who lived through the Winter Hill Gang's reign, the ghosts remain. Kevin Weeks' confession ensures those ghosts will never be forgotten, that the victims will be remembered, and that the truth about what really happened inside the Winter Hill Gang will stand as a warning to future generations. This is the legacy of Kevin Weeks, not the crimes he committed, but the truth he finally told. It's a small redemption for a lifetime of wrongs, a crack of light in decades of darkness. And perhaps in that small crack of light, there's hope that even the worst among us can choose, finally, to tell the truth.